Always pay close attention to your neighbors, especially when you're buying or renting a new place. My story begins like most horror stories found online, but it has one unique feature. I recently experienced it firsthand and came face to face with something completely illogical, irrational, and otherworldly. All because I chased a cheap price and hastily rented an inexpensive, yet decent, den. Now I understand why I paid next to nothing for it, even though such housing usually costs many times more. But let's start from the beginning. I want to make it clear that the apartment itself wasn't the issue. No grandmothers or grandfathers had ever died there. It wasn't cursed by Satanists or cultists. It was a simple two-room apartment with a bit of cosmetic renovation and a simply charming view of our Central Park. The problem was the neighbors. More precisely, the female neighbor. But more on that later. This all happened very recently, about 4 days ago, to be exact. I rented the apartment directly from the owners, not through an agency. They were an elderly couple who were tired of the city bustle and decided to spend their remaining years in the countryside. A little extra money never hurts anyone these days. We didn't sign any contracts. We just agreed that everything should be fine and quiet. I assured them I had no intention of throwing loud parties. I'm just a simple country guy who decided to try his luck in the city since there are absolutely no prospects in our backwater. Speaking of parties, the landlords immediately warned me not to make too much noise, as a very old woman lived next door. If she heard loud music, she could easily call the police to have it turned down, along with whoever turned it on. This was a rough translation of what they said. In reality, according to the owners, an extremely elderly woman lived next to me who was constantly displeased with everything. I listened to their warning and nodded silently, already anticipating getting the keys and having them leave. About 10 minutes later, after the woman's stories about their beautiful and cozy house in the village, they finally left. Her husband barely managed to shut her up, probably sensing from my expression that I wasn't particularly interested in her stories. She was a peculiar woman, seemingly very kind. She even offered me tea and cookies when I arrived, or so I thought at the time. Now I realize she was probably hinting at something, which I can't say about her husband. The landlord was overly serious, especially when the conversation turned to the neighbor. His expression suggested they were holding something back, either about the apartment or the neighbors. But once silence fell in the hallway and the front door closed, I pushed all negative thoughts from my mind. As I unpacked my few belongings, I quietly rejoiced that I had finally left my hole and rented a very decent apartment almost in the city center, and for such a low price. That childlike joy and emotion clouded my good judgment then and didn't allow my brain to wonder why such a low price for such a good living space. The apartment was already cleaned and smelled cozy. I didn't have to bother with cleaning, dusting, or rearranging anything. There were also minimal landlord's belongings left, but everything in the apartment immediately went into the pantry. A new chapter in my life had successfully begun, and I was incredibly happy about it, like a child, honestly. The smile never left my face, and my mood was simply soaring. But everything would change very soon. Very soon, I would regret being here, in this house, in this apartment. For now, though, I could open my laptop, make some hot tea, and dive into the world of the internet and degradation. That's exactly what I did. I put on the kettle, dropped a tea bag, left over from the landlords, into a cup, and sat down at my laptop. I turned on some music through the speakers and began to crush enemy tanks. I sat there, sipping tea and glued to the screen, until late evening. Slowly but surely, darkness descended, and the apartment seemed to become cozier. I don't know, it sounds silly, but a whole day at the computer took its toll. By evening, my head started to ache a little. I stood up from the stool, stretched, and decided to go out, visit the store, and just get some fresh air. This is where everything began. I got dressed, put on my jacket, grabbed my wallet, and went out onto the stairwell. As I was locking the not-so-great door lock, I caught a glimpse of the neighboring door ajar out of the corner of my eye. Then I turned my head slightly in that direction. I saw an old woman, barely peeking out with one eye. Honestly, I immediately felt uneasy for some reason. I don't know, she seemed like a perfectly ordinary old woman, but she was peeking out. It must have been interesting to her to see what kind of new neighbor had appeared. Turning completely towards her, I politely greeted her. When I didn't hear a response, I went downstairs. I can't stand people like this, I thought to myself. Is it really so hard for you, old hag, to nod your head and say hello? I continued down to the first floor. I went outside. The weather was perfect, warm and pleasant. Ideal. And I, like an idiot, had put on a warm jacket. I'd had to unzip it. I walked through the park to the store, bought some tasty treats with my remaining money, and headed home with a satisfied look on my face. As I entered the building again and went up to my floor, just as I was taking the key out of my pocket, I again noticed, out of the corner of my eye, the same old woman. Just like an hour ago, she was peeking out with one eye from her barely ajar door. Had she been staring into space for a whole hour? Maybe so, I asked myself, when I heard a hiss. Something started. The stairwell was dead silent, and her whisper was strangely loud and clear. I thought she was talking to me and asked, "Are you talking to me?" She was whispering and looking straight into my eyes. "What are you saying? I didn't hear you." And then, suddenly, instead of a whisper, she said in a full voice, "Don't make noise." And she slammed the door. The windows in the stairwell rattled from the impact. After the door slammed, I heard the sound of a lock clicking, and then silence. I stood there, stunned by what had just happened, for another 5 minutes or so in that silence. No, she was definitely not all there. Honestly, that slam really scared me. "Don't make noise," she said. When did I make noise? Is she sick? I don't understand at all. Although, when I played music on the computer, it wasn't very loud, I thought to myself. I opened the apartment door. This encounter with the completely inadequate neighbor seemed to have drained all the positivity I had had earlier in the day. The smile vanished from my face. I don't know, I just felt uneasy. The apartment, which had seemed cozy as darkness fell, no longer felt that way. An inexplicable anxiety washed over me, and to distract myself, I went to the kitchen. I wanted to cook something to eat. After all, I hadn't eaten anything all day while I was on the computer. While cooking, I got a little distracted from the incident in the stairwell and accidentally bumped some washed dishes near the sink. I stepped back when the oil spat from the frying pan, hitting it with my elbow. For a second, the apartment was filled with the crash of broken dishes. Then silence. I froze in the kitchen like a naughty child waiting for a scolding from his mom. I repeat, silence. And in that silence, I heard a knock. At first, I thought I imagined it, but listening closely, I realized I hadn't. It was indeed the old woman next door knocking, and quite forcefully, I might add. Probably with a stick or a crutch. Oh, for crying out loud, do I not even get to breathe now? It's only 9 p.m. If it were night and I was making noise, fine, I could understand that. But now, what the hell are you knocking for, you old hag? I grumbled these thoughts to myself as I gathered the shards of the plates. The knocking continued despite the silence. I thought, she'll knock for a bit and then stop. But no, 15 minutes had passed, and the knocking on the wall continued. She's definitely lost her mind, I thought. Honestly, I gathered all the broken dishes into a bag, walked over to the wall, and knocked back at her. The knocking from her apartment stopped. Thank God, I thought, and went back to my laptop. I hadn't even sat down on the stool when I heard sounds from the neighboring apartment again. Now, in addition to the knocking, there was a voice. You know, that unpleasant, old, wheezing voice. Although the walls between the apartments were thin, it was impossible to understand what she was mumbling. Crazy old woman, for crying out loud. But everything was fine, you know? I was like a teapot then, and with every passing minute of that mumbling from behind the wall, I was getting closer and closer to boiling over. But after half an hour, it didn't stop, and after an hour, it still hadn't. And I finally boiled over. I flew out into the stairwell and knocked on her door. No one opened. I knocked for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. Still no one. I went back into my apartment. The knocking and mumbling were no longer audible. Finally, I thought, it's still too early to sleep. I put on my headphones and sat down at my laptop, turning on music. I was sitting peacefully when, through the music, I heard a ring at the front door. That inexplicable anxiety returned to me instantly, and a slight tingling started all over my body. I slowly took off my headphones and listened. Someone was persistently and continuously ringing my doorbell. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 11 p.m. I wasn't expecting any guests. I immediately knew it was the neighbor ringing. Something must have displeased her again. I walked into the hallway and looked through the peephole. There she was, the old woman, in a gray nightgown, thin as if starved, leaning on a stick. Her hair was a mess. In short, an ordinary old woman who looked like she'd been roused from her bed in the middle of the night by an alarm. I opened the door, thinking I'd give her a piece of my mind. "Excuse me, what do you need? Why were you knocking on my wall? You asked me not to make noise, but you're making noise yourself," I said in a raised tone. "Music." Placing a finger to her lips, the old woman hissed, "She'll hear." "Be quiet. Don't make noise." "I'm not making noise, you old hag," I shouted indignantly. "What do you want? I'll call the police now." Upon hearing the word, police, she seemed to come to her senses. She looked at me with displeasure and scurried back into her apartment, slamming the door very loudly again. There was something in her gaze, something strange. It was as if she was telling me, "You shouldn't talk to me like that, kid." And another thing. She had been barely standing in front of me. If she hadn't been leaning on her stick, she would have fallen and rolled down the stairs. But as soon as I confronted her, she practically ran like a teenager. This seemed quite strange to me and made me very uneasy. But it didn't end there. When I went back inside, I immediately heard rapid footsteps behind the wall. It seemed like someone was running in circles behind the wall, honestly. But the old woman who had just come to my door couldn't run like that. She was so frail. Maybe she had someone else living with her? But no, she ran back into her own apartment. This was some kind of devilry. Just thinking about all of this made me lose the desire to sit at my laptop. I didn't want to sleep either. My head was filled with guesses and theories about the neighbor. What was wrong with her? And as various conjectures came to mind, an inexplicable anxiety grew within me, and deep down, something told me it would reach its peak tonight. I tried to dismiss it all by thinking it was just a crazy, inadequate old woman. What could she do to me? Besides, the landlords had warned me about this. Why was I even worrying? But I couldn't stop worrying. The sounds behind the wall and the fast footsteps continued, and just imagining what was happening behind that wall sent a chill down my spine. I sat on the sofa for about 10 minutes, then the footsteps behind the wall stopped, and the doorbell rang again, followed by a knock. I slowly walked into the hallway and looked through the peephole. It was dark in the stairwell. Had the lights been cut off? I thought to myself. Only by looking closer did I see a rapidly moving white spot. I immediately realized it was the neighbor again. "What do you want from me, you old hag? You probably even turned off the light yourself." At this, my patience snapped, and I decided to call the police. What they told me plunged me into true horror. It turned out I wasn't the first person to call them today, or yesterday, or the day before, from this building. The police, according to them, were simply fed up with answering that the apartment was empty, that no one had lived in it for about 3 years. I dropped the phone from my hands. I was instantly paralyzed, and then there was a bang on the door. The bang was quite strong, as if whoever was there on the stairwell behind the door really didn't want the truth to come out. After the first bang, of course, a second, even stronger one followed. And the door to this apartment was weak, old. I started to notice it giving way little by little. Damn, so she's not alone, that old hag who tormented me. The banging on the door continued, but now something like the moaning of a mentally ill person was added to it. I was so scared then that I can't even describe it. I stood there, lost in the apartment, not knowing what to do. Trembling, I frantically picked up the phone, thinking of calling the police again, but it was broken. The screen was shattered, and it simply wouldn't turn on. And then, the banging on the door stopped as abruptly as it had begun, and I heard receding footsteps and a door slam. What was that just now? What came out of that apartment? And why the hell did the police tell me the apartment was locked and empty if I saw the old woman peeking out of there this afternoon? Running all these questions through my head, I approached the door to check on it, as it looked very bad after such a series of blows. And then, the devil tempted me to look through the peephole again to make sure everything was alright, that she had left. Yeah, right. I looked through the peephole, and she was sitting in the corner of the landing. And as if she saw me from the other side through the peephole, she sprang up and stopped right in front of my door. I jumped back from the door in surprise and took small steps backward as I saw the doorknob jiggle. Then, a crooked, hoarse voice was heard, "Open. Open the door." That voice sent shivers down my spine. It was something terrifying, inhuman. She was screaming and rattling the doorknob. I honestly thought I would turn gray on the spot. But the scariest part was yet to come. With those small steps, I reached the room when another bang on the door rang out, and it opened. A characteristic creak was heard. I instantly jumped into the old wardrobe and froze, trying not to even breathe. I then heard fast footsteps moving towards me, to the room where the wardrobe stood. Through the crack, I watched. That otherworldly expletive removed, didn't realize where I was and started walking around, looking. She went into the other room, moving quickly, not with a normal, measured step. She sharply jerked her head. Her nightgown was gray and dirty, and her legs and arms were also gray, covered in huge blue veins, and her mouth was constantly open with terrible yellow teeth. While she was walking in the second room, I had two options. Either stay hidden until the end or run now while there was a chance. I chose the latter. I opened the wardrobe door and ran out of the apartment like a madman, only grabbing the sneakers standing in the hallway on my way, and then ran down the stairs and out of the house, running towards the park without looking back. I stayed there until morning. Fortunately, it wasn't cold outside. I definitely didn't want to go back to the apartment, but I needed to get my things and documents. My laptop and clothes were all there, but I only decided to return there in the late morning. I entered the building, went up to my floor. The apartment door was open. The broken lock was lying in the hallway. I rushed inside, quickly packed everything into a bag, and ran out of the apartment. On the way, I glanced at the neighbor's door. It was sealed. It was clear that the seal had been there not since today, but for several years already. In the stairwell, I met another old woman. "Are you all moving out?" I just silently scurried past her, and she shouted after me, "You shouldn't have made noise. You would have lived peacefully. The apartment is good and cheap." Crazy old people. Where did I end up? What was this phenomenon with the seal? And how did that old woman know what happened? Or was I not the first one? There were no answers to these questions, and I didn't want to look for them. What I had experienced was enough. I didn't tell the landlords anything, I just moved out bluntly. Even now, living in a new apartment, I remember that terrifying night, that nightmarish voice.